It's good. I'm glad at least one person is doing well. All right, start in exactly 1 minute, and we can begin talking about the one and only Rene Descartes. Also, I assume the chat going on in the QQ chat right now is, well, if you want me to answer you, it's going to have to be in English. But if you don't want me to answer you, Chinese is fine. All right, cool. By my clock, it is 9:05, which means it is time for us to begin. So let's do so. Before I do, first sound check. Everyone can hear me and understand me okay. Great. All right, let's begin. So, this is a presentation on the one and only Rene Descartes. Um, that is a bit of American humor. If you read a bit about Rene Descartes with the pre-reading and you know a bit of, well, American humor, you might find that funny, you might not. Bonus points to whoever can tell me why it's funny, which is, I think, an extra question I'll add to the discussion questions on Reddit. And that reminds me, by the way, thank you to all of those who have been participating in the discussion on Reddit. There have been a lot of really great contributions, and I'm learning some, and I hope you guys are learning a lot. There'll be another set of discussion questions posted after class. So yeah, as I've said before, this is like your really your one and only chance to, first of all, participate in a discussion. Second of all, practice writing English. Practice writing English in an analytical fashion, in a philosophical fashion. So I think this is a really good opportunity for you guys. Plus, you'll find it fun, I hope. So yes, if you haven't yet joined, and if you haven't yet started posting comments and replies to discussion questions, I advise you to do so starting literally right after this class. It'll do a lot for you, improve your understanding of philosophy, it'll improve your English. Yeah, it'll be great. So yeah, that's that. But now let's talk about René Descartes. So René Descartes was a French philosopher, mathematician, and scientist in the 17th century, so the 1600s. So he attempted to merge science, mathematics, ethics, philosophy, and theology into one sort of like meta theory of knowledge, and he tried to tie this all together using deduction. And I know we've covered what deduction is before, but just in case you forget, deduction is when you start with logical premises and then you form an argument towards the conclusion. So for instance, you know, Aristotle has his famous syllogisms, which go, the classic example is, you know, all men are mortal, so all men can die, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. If the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. Whether or not the premises are true, or what we can know about the premises, is of course something that Francis Bacon had a lot of trouble with, and we'll see Descartes has trouble with too, but in a different sense. Descartes, however, is still using deduction. He's not using induction for his philosophy. And induction is, again, reasoning from patterns, like scientists do, right? I've seen this happen 100 times, therefore it'll happen 101st time, 101 times. You know, the sun will rise up again tomorrow because it's risen up every day for the past, you know, billion years. Okay, cool. So this is Descartes. He's trying to make philosophy into this overarching theory of knowledge, of science, with math, with ethics, and even medicine, although he never really did much in medicine. All right, so we have a quote here. Thus, all philosophy is like a tree, of which metaphysics is the root. Metaphysics here is what we think of as just philosophy, okay? Of which metaphysics is the root, physics the trunk, and all the other sciences, the branches that grow out of this trunk, which are reduced to three principles, namely medicine, mechanics, and ethics. By the science of morals, I understand the highest and most perfect, which, presupposing an entire knowledge of the other sciences, is the last degree of wisdom. So this is a little strange, as you might imagine, to say, well, you can really only understand ethics once you understand physics. But that is the way he thought. It's also interesting here to see the distinction between physics and mechanics. There's a lot of weird stuff about his thought processes going on here. He never really defends why he thinks philosophy is a tree in this sense. I think it just seems, in an Aristotelian sense, most perfect, right? Which you'll remember from our discussion of Aquinas, something you hear a lot. He relates all this stuff to godliness a lot. So I think it just makes sense for him that everything is connected like this. And you can learn philosophy by first starting, or learn physics first starting with philosophy, and then from physics you get everything else coming out, including ethics. Well, and what does Russell have to say about René Descartes? Well, he says, René Descartes is usually considered the founder of modern philosophy, and I think rightly. He is the first man of high philosophic capacity whose outlook is profoundly um, affected by the new physics and astronomy. While it is true that he retains much of scholasticism, he does not accept foundations laid by predecessors, but endeavors to construct a complete philosophic edifice de novo. This had not happened since Aristotle. So that might be a little difficult language, but he endeavors, he tries hard to construct a complete philosophic edifice. So an edifice is literally a building, but in this case, he's saying like a metaphorical building. So he's trying hard to build up a total structure of philosophy de novo, from nothing or from the new, or something that's new. So it's a complete philosophic edifice out of nothing, and he's, according to Russell, he's the first guy to try this since Aristotle. Like Aristotle also threw out everything that came before him and built up something new. Descartes, about 1800 years later, is the first guy to try that again. Okay, so it's pretty impressive. Let's get a sense of Descartes the man. So Descartes, who is this gentleman here with the long hair and the goatee, he's born to a wealthy non-noble family in 1596. His dad was a lawyer. He was sickly, and he remained in poor health throughout his entire life, but he's well and broadly educated. He joins the military. He actually joins a couple militaries. Apparently, he wants to see the world. He has sort of a crazy life path where first he's going to be a lawyer, and then he's going to be a military man, and then he's going to be a writer. So he sort of bounces around from thing to thing. Little interesting story here. One of the very famous stories about Descartes is while he's in the Bavarian army, so one of the armies he's joined, it's middle of winter. He's in Bavaria, which is Germany. It's very cold. It's so cold that he finds this oven. And apparently there were like these whole rooms in Bavaria which were ovens used to cook things at a low temperature. So it's like very warm, but it's not scalding. So he's very cold. He goes in the oven and he spends the entire day in the oven. And while he's in there, he's like in his early 20s at the time. He has 3 visions, and these visions reveal to him all of his philosophy and all of his mathematics. And when he exits from the oven a whole day later, he has these visions, and that's what he's going to pursue for the rest of his life, sort of writing down his visions. So pretty interesting story. And Russell makes a bit of a joke about it, where he says, Socrates' mind worked only in the cold, while Descartes' mind, works in the warmth, because Socrates is the guy who's famously standing out in the winter the whole day thinking about problems. So different temperatures for different philosophers. All right. Descartes, although a Frenchman, he moves to Netherlands in 1628, where he stays for the rest of his life for the most part. Netherlands at this point is a bastion of free speech, which is important because Descartes is living at a time in which, as he learns from the condemnation of Galileo, free speech and free thought is not guaranteed. And in fact, saying the wrong thing can be quite dangerous. The church isn't as powerful as it was, but it's still powerful enough to make your life very, very, very unpleasant if you say something that they are not a fan of. So in the Netherlands, Descartes publishes all his most important works. He would have published a complete book on physics, but he doesn't, because even in the Netherlands, he's scared of the church. So that only comes out in excerpts and finally comes out in full after he dies. and then he dies, and that Descartes dies in 1650 after moving to Sweden to tutor Queen Christina in philosophy. And the story goes that Descartes was a lazy man and a bit of a sickly man, so he's used to rising up early. Queen Christina is apparently, or rising up late rather. Queen Christina, she's an early riser, and she's like, no, we have to get up at 5 a.m. to do philosophy. And the combination of being in Sweden, which is, of course, incredibly cold, and rising up at 5 a.m., Descartes, somewhat old man at this point, you know, he's in his 50s, he can't handle it, and it kills him. And that's why I never wake up before 9 a.m., because it killed Descartes. Okay, so a bit of historical background. So Descartes' life, it's not so impacted by sort of geography as like Francis Bacon or someone like that, but it is interesting. He bounces around from country to country, so I thought I'd give you guys a brief historical idea of exactly where he's going. He's born in France. He serves in the Dutch States Army, serves in the army of Bavaria. He goes to Paris, which is somewhere in the center here. I should know that. And then he dies in Sweden. So he really goes all over continental Europe, all over Western Europe. So let's take a look at the countries where he goes. So in France, Descartes is living during the reigns of King Henri IV, King Louis XIII, and King Louis XIV. Henri IV, Henri IV, if you want to say it in the French way, reigns from 1589 to 1610. The Protestant, and as you should know, France at this time was very Catholic, and so having a king being a Protestant was not something they were very happy with. And after he assumes the throne, after he becomes king, he faces 12 assassination attempts. And that's the ones we know about, so you have to assume there are a lot more. He does eventually convert to Catholicism, but allows religious freedom for Protestants. And this is important because there was basically a civil war going on in France at the time between Protestants and Catholics. In France, the Protestants were called Huguenots, and some of them were very politically powerful, even though, of course, you know, they were going against the church. So Henri IV is one of the most beloved French kings. First of all, for his tolerance, you know, he tolerates Catholics, he tolerates Protestants, and he helps stop violence between them. And he also has a lot of civic works, including his establishment of the college, which René Descartes attended, which was called La Flèche, in case you're wondering, La Flèche. And as you might expect from a man who faced 12 assassination attempts, finally one of them got him. He was stabbed by a radical Catholic, and he died. But he was beloved during his reign. He was beloved after his reign. French people still love him, and there are quite a lot of things named after him. So the next king we get is King Louis XIII, who reigns from 1610 to 1643. Because Henri IV is murdered, King Louis XIII assumes the throne at an awkward time. He's only a child. His mother is a Medici, so Machiavelli, eh? So his mother's a Medici, and so she suddenly gets power of the throne while King Louis XIII grows up. So she relies on Italians to help her. These Italians generally focus on enriching themselves, and they don't help the country that much. France falls into chaos. King Louis XIII, he becomes 18, and his first thing he does is he kicks out his mother, his own mother, and he executes all of her advisors. Eventually, she's allowed to come back, presumably her advisors stay dead. His advisor during this time, King Louis the 13th's advisor is Cardinal Richelieu, who you might remember from Three Musketeers, where he's the villain. Richelieu was not a bad guy, but he did get a rather harsh reputation because he helped transform King Louis the 13th into an absolute monarch by revoking the privileges of nobles, sometimes forcefully. So, you know, France at this time was a land of very powerful nobility, and any guy like Richelieu who helps a king take away the power of nobles is not going to be remembered fondly by the nobles. There was also King Louis XIV after King Louis XIII. So King Louis XIV starts in 1643. He's fascinating. He's known as the Sun King. He builds Versailles. I mean, his life and his politics are incredible, and I wish I could talk about them, but they really don't have much of an impact on Descartes. But if European history is something that interests you, if you've been watching Game of Thrones and are wondering what that was like in real life, definitely read about Louis XIV. He's a really interesting guy. Really, really interesting. And also reigns for an incredibly long time. He reigns for like 50 years. All right, so that's France. Now, the next place that Descartes goes, the Dutch Republic. So remember, this is where Descartes goes when he wants to publish his works. So you probably haven't heard of this before. It's not often talked about in history classes, but it was important. So it existed from 1581 to 1795. It used to be part of the Holy Roman Empire, but then it declared freedom. It was a republic, as it sounds, so it wasn't the sort of liberal democracy that the United States was, but it was actually more of a republic than I'd say any other country in Europe at that time. So it's economically incredibly successful. First of all, although it's small, they have a very powerful navy, and that allows them to dominate trade around the entire world. You've probably heard of the Dutch East India Company, the world's first publicly traded company, and because of that, it's also the Dutch Republic has the world's first stock exchange. So I don't know if any of you trade stocks, buying and selling, but if you do, you can thank the Dutch Republic for your wins, or perhaps blame them for your losses. Either way, they create the first stock exchange. And as they are an entirely commercial republic, you can think of them maybe sort of like Hong Kong or Singapore, like very, very focused commercially. Like in a lot of ways, that was their purpose for being. Although they're much more aggressive militarily than Hong Kong or Singapore have ever been. So they have very liberal values, including very aggressive promotion of freedom of religion and freedom of speech, freedom of the press. So many sort of intellectual refugees end up there. Descartes' one of them, but there's also Hobbes, Locke, and Spinoza, which are all names you should recognize. So, little interesting fact, you'd think that a republic existing in Europe would be something that the founding fathers of America would be very impressed with, and they'd be big fans of. It turns out they're not. I'm not entirely sure why they dislike them so much, but I found a quote from James Madison, which says the Dutch Republic exhibits imbecility in the government, discord among the provinces, foreign influences and dignities, a precarious existence in peace, and peculiar calamities from war. So I guess he thinks they're not powerful enough, and also they're sort of stupid. And maybe he's right, because it doesn't last incredibly long, although it does last for about 200 years. So, all right. Remember, he also serves in the army of Bavaria. So Bavaria is what we would think of it now as a part of Germany. Back then, it was a territory of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire stretched throughout a lot of Western Europe and encompassed some 25 million people. So this is basically the Holy Roman Empire here. So the Holy Roman Empire has an emperor, as you'd expect from an empire. The territories are pretty independent, though, and they gain more or less independence depending on who's powerful at the time and who has a bigger army. So that means the history of the Holy Roman Empire is very, very complicated, and they're always invading each other. And there's a lot of backstabbing and a lot of political machinations. So I'm just gonna skip over that for now. But it makes sense that someone like Descartes, who's young, intelligent, and wants to fight, he can find a place for himself in the Bavarian army because they are always fighting. And this is a famous castle in Bavaria. Unfortunately, it is not during Descartes' time. It's an 1800s era castle. However, I think it is probably the prettiest castle in the world. You might recognize it from some Disney movies, including Beauty and the Beast. It's very beautiful, and you can visit it today if you want to travel to Bavaria. It's very popular. All right. And last up, we have Descartes in Sweden, which is where he dies. So when Descartes moves to Sweden, Sweden is in the midst of transforming itself from this irrelevant, poor country in Northern Europe to a dominant power in Northern Europe. It was technically an alliance with the Danes, with Denmark, which, in case you're wondering, is where like a quarter of my ancestry is from. And so I probably had some ancestors in Denmark around that time. In fact, I know I did. Sweden's technically in an alliance with the Danes, but it didn't go so well for Sweden. So finally they liberate themselves and they transform themselves into this military power, and they make up for lost time by invading every country around them. It's sort of astonishing when you look at how much they invade in like 200 years. And then they get defeated by Russia in one war as Russia becomes a dominant power. And then so Sweden just takes Finland and then gives up. And they haven't fought since 1814. So they sort of got all of the war that they wanted over the course of 200 years. And yeah, they just haven't felt like fighting since then. Although modern Sweden is, strangely enough, an exporter of military technology, which would be interesting to know how that would happen, how that happened. And so we have Queen Christina on the left here. And who is this but the man we're here to talk about today, Rene Descartes, with his famous goatee and long hair. All right. So, Descartes' philosophy. Now that we got a bit of an idea of historical background, let's go over his philosophy. So he writes very widely, so we'll have to take it piece by piece. Before we do that, though, can everyone hear me, understand me? Everyone knows what's going on? Basically, understood what I said? Great. All right. Then let's get back to it with Rene Descartes and his philosophy. And I think the important thing to remember with Descartes' philosophy is he's trying to build everything up through deduction, and he's trying to build up everything logically. It's from the ground up. He clears out everything before him, for the most part. And this is a statue of Descartes. I'm not sure exactly where this is, but has his famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. I don't know what that would be in Chinese. I don't know how to say therefore. Sure, something like that. Anyways, in French, je pense, donc je suis. I think, therefore I am. All right. So how does Descartes build things from the ground up? Well, so he uses this Cartesian skepticism as a means for establishing absolute knowledge. And for Descartes, skepticism means everything that can be doubted should be doubted and should be tossed out. So for instance, the syllogisms of Aristotle, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, only exists in a state of probability so far as you can say all men are mortal, or so far as you can say Socrates is a man. And if they try to express truths about the world rather than definitional truths, they rely on sensation. So it's what you see, what you smell, what you hear. And Descartes' not a fan of this. He's sort of like Bacon in that way. He's not a fan of this idea of just blind sensation. And Descartes says they're unreliable, they're on weak foundation, and they're not fruitful. By which he means these syllogisms of Aristotle, you're not going to learn anything that you don't already know. Like you're playing word games, but you're not learning truth. Again, sort of like Bacon. So, but Descartes takes a different path and he says, well, so let's just start figuring out what we actually know. What do we know to be true and what can be doubted? Well, what can be doubted? Pretty much everything. You can doubt your senses. You're not sure whether you're dreaming or awake. You think you smell your mom cooking dinner, but in fact you're asleep and dreaming it. You could doubt logic and mathematics, because first of all, Descartes does occasionally make mistakes in his mathematics, and he might just be doing so continually and not even realize it. Or it's possible that, for instance, there's some demon who's consistently making us get the wrong result. The important thing to remember here is Descartes doesn't actually think there's a demon making him get the wrong result, but he's saying it is possible. And as long as there's possible that every time he does logic or math, he's doing it wrong, then we have to throw that out. We can't rely on logic and we can't rely on math. Here we got a picture of Descartes as his own demon, which was kind of clever. Okay. So then we have to think about what exactly is there is that can't be doubted. We can doubt our logic, we can doubt our math, but what can't we doubt? Well, we can't doubt the fact that there's a thinking part of us which exists. So even if everything we see is wrong, everything we think is wrong, everything we know is wrong, that still means there is something that is wrong. Even if there's this demon in the sky that is tricking us constantly, he still needs to trick us. Like there needs to be an us to trick, right? That's why he says, I think, therefore I am, or cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Because because that's his proof of his existence. This joke here, although sort of cute, is a conception about Descartes. It's not saying, once he stops thinking, then he disappears, right? That's common misconception. It's not that because Descartes is a thinking man, he exists. He's saying because people think in general, that means that people exist, that there is a thinking part of them that exists, and that is the only thing that we can know. All right. So now that we know that the only part of us that we can know exists is a thinking part of us, the only thing we know for sure is that a thinking part of us exists, it's worth asking how we know the rest of the world. Because we do go through the world, we go through it pretty well, we walk around, we don't bump into things, we eat, we sleep, we drink, whatever, and it tends to go pretty well, and it does seem very real. Like, even if you're like, oh, well, I can doubt the fact that maybe food doesn't exist and maybe eating doesn't exist, it's a lot easier to tell yourself that when you're full than when you're hungry. Like, when you're hungry, despite all your logical arguments, food and eating seem very, very real. So, well, according to Descartes, the way we should think about this is you think you interpret things with your senses. But really, you're not interpreting it with your senses, you're interpreting it with your mind. So if you take a piece of wax, and this is Descartes' example, and this is wax here, right? Beeswax, honey, wax. Yeah. So you take a piece of wax, if you bring it close to a fire, it will change in look, it'll become like transparent, it'll change in smell, it'll no longer smell so much like honey, it'll change in temperature, but we still see it as the same piece of wax. So he says it can't be that we're actually thinking that things are wax based on what they look like or what they smell like, because we can think two things are the same piece of wax, even though they look the same, we think two things are the same things of wax, even though they look different, they smell different, they feel different. It's some mental process we go through that allows us to interpret those two pieces of wax as the same. Okay? So Descartes says, well, that means our better means of perception is not the senses, but the mind. He says it's much easier to deceive the senses than to deceive the mind. So Descartes also has a very strange section in here about God, where he's trying to prove that, like, what we can see isn't false. Like, it's not true that, for instance, every time I think I see a dog, I'm really seeing a cat. And his proof for this is essentially God is too good to allow to do that because he's not a deceiver. And so he starts off by proving God, and then he uses Aquinas' arguments, which we've gone over some problems with. And it's also, people always say it's very strange for him to be like, this is how we will prove that everything we see is real, because God is good. It's weak and it's a little disappointing. So we'll skip over them. If you want to read them on your own, you're welcome to, but I will tell you they're almost exactly the same as Aquinas' arguments. So now we've established, according to Descartes, we can trust our senses. We interpret things through our minds. There's a thinking part of us that exists. Okay, so we've established essentially that we exist as thinking beings. So we both think and we are. And even by saying that, it seems like there are two parts of us. the mind or soul and the being or the body, right? And you can prove that the mind exists with cogito ergo sum, and that's identical to the soul by Descartes' reckoning. And you can, the body you prove exists through sensation, which, Descartes' argument is, again, God is good, so he wouldn't lie to us. So, it's obvious that the mind and the body, even though Descartes says they're separate, it's true that they interact. So a loud noise can give you a headache, and that's very hard to think when you have a headache. So that's the body affecting the mind. On the other hand, if I want to move my arm or if I want to talk, then the mind has to affect the body. They're not the same, though, because first of all, by religious sense, the soul ascends to heaven and it's immortal and immaterial, and the body does not ascend to heaven, and it's not material, it exists, right? And it also can't be the same logically, because the soul isn't found anywhere in the body. There's no space for the soul. And the body is acted upon by the laws of nature, which are deterministic. Someone pushes you and you stumble. But it seems like we have free will, which, according to Descartes, we have to have free will. According to other people, it's a problem. If there is no soul, how do we have free will? At what point does a mind actually be able to decide for itself to do something? Like, it's a difficult question. So then, how do they affect each other? You have an immaterial soul and a material body. You need some point of contact. You need some ability for the mind to affect the body. It's a great question. It's a great point. And Descartes' answer is not so good. He says the pineal gland. And his idea is this small part of the brain, which does exist. If you ever take an anatomy class, you'll learn about it. His idea is this small part of the brain, the pineal gland, is where the soul is, and that's where it connects the body. You can see why that's like tempting, because it's pretty centrally located, and it's like small and sort of weird looking. Unfortunately, we now know, due to science, that has to do with the production of melatonin, and has nothing to do with the soul at all. Even in Descartes' time, they didn't think that answer was particularly good. That was sort of like a thing that some people took seriously, but I think pretty quickly they were like, yeah, that's not a great answer. It's a good question. It's a good question how the mind and body interact. The pineal gland is not a good answer. All right. So, last up. Or sorry, not last up, but almost last up. Descartes' mathematics. So this is stuff you guys hopefully all recognize. This isn't a math course, so I won't go into what he did too in depth. But his mathematics is very important, and it does relate a lot to his philosophy. So he's a pioneer of analytic geometry, which uses algebra to describe geometry and sort of places algebra at the forefront. And before this, European mathematicians, were very much in the Greek mode, which privileged geometry and geometrical proofs above everything. Like, that was math. Math was geometry, and everything else was meh. But Descartes loves algebra. Algebra is rigorous, it's abstract, it expresses absolute truths. If x plus 2 equals 5, x equals 3. And that is an absolute truth. So Descartes helps develop a system to use algebra to describe geometry. And sort of the most important way he does this is with the Cartesian coordinate plane. And I have one here. You might call this the XY plane or the 2D plane. I just realized that these axes are mislabeled. That's unfortunate. But as you can see on this, you can put geometrical shapes and describe them algebraically. You know, you can come up with linear equations for each of these. And that's very important. That helps transform geometry into as rigorous and abstract means of mathematics as Descartes wants it to be, and that leads into calculus and all the other forms of math we have today. So Descartes is actually a very important mathematician. And finally, science, specifically physics, which is where Descartes has his most success. So Descartes emphasizes mechanical understanding of physics and science, using this geometrical understanding of physical bodies. So the mechanical part is very important. He uses basically motion and forces and whatever to come up with physics. And he models it all with geometry. For instance, you can see here that in this circular motion, he's actually plotting it on an XY plane. And he's saying if you release it here, it goes in a straight line. If you release it here, it goes in a straight line. And he's using basically triangles to come up with these laws of motion for how things should interact. And that is a big improvement over Aristotelian science. And remember, Aristotelian science is very focused on, well, teleological explanations, which we'll go through again in a sec. So his laws of motion are good. They're actually pretty similar to Newton's, you know, an object in motion must stay in motion, that sort of stuff. And then Descartes, typical Descartes, he gets super weird when it comes time to justify them, because instead of being like, well, here are experiments I've done which prove them, or, you know, here's my mathematical explanation. I mean, he does that, but he also says, well, God is perfect. And if you want the most perfect form of laws of motion, these are the most perfect forms, and they're therefore reflective of God. Which, you know, sometimes you gotta love the guy, and sometimes you gotta be like, Descartes, how could you possibly think that? But the other interesting thing about Cartesian science, and this was the part that was both prescient, so it was both before its time and sort of ridiculous. He imagined all matter as composed of tiny parts, which fit in well with a scientific theory at the time called atomism, from which we get the word atom. And so he wanted to understand matter by seeing how the tiny parts flowed and interacted with each other. So gravity, for instance, works not by an Aristotelian explanation where that's where like objects are supposed to be, but instead it's like this diffusion of tiny parts. So it's like heavy objects would sink until they hit the ground because they were heavier, and it'd be sort of like this sense of sort of buoyancy, like relative buoyancies. Again, it was that part of it was thrown out pretty soon after Descartes because Newton comes along and Newton has a way better explanation. But it was an attempt to explain gravity in a mechanical sense, which was important. So let's see if we can cover the background to Descartes' philosophy before we hit the break. Okay. So Descartes' philosophy comes from a couple sources. It's also very original. His philosophy is highly influenced by a mentor he has as a young man named Isaac Beeckman, who introduces to him like the works of the Italian Renaissance and of the Arabs, so the like Arabic scientific mathematic revival. So we get some Arab math here, which is evidently having to do with, looks like radii and radiuses and triangles and arcs. And Descartes is also very influenced by the scholastic that he receives at La Flèche. Remember, the scholastics are guys like Aquinas. So one thing that's very interesting is comparing Bacon and Descartes. So Bacon, he's this British man. He's about 30 years older than Descartes. Descartes' a Frenchman, so Protestant Catholic. Both reject scholasticism, and presumably are coming about it for around the same reasons, but come to very different solutions for what should be there instead of scholasticism. So, interesting to think about. So who was Isaac Beeckman? So Isaac Beeckman is a Dutch philosopher and scientist. In Dutch Republic, that's where Descartes first serves as a soldier and later goes to sort of escape religious persecution. So Beeckman teaches Descartes when Descartes' a young soldier in Leiden. So they strike up a fast friendship. Beeckman introduces to Descartes atomism, so the idea that all matter is composed of tiny parts. And he also teaches Descartes about Galileo, and he teaches him about some of the Arabic mathematicians. And the most important influence that Beeckman has on Descartes is he inspires Descartes to understand the world mathematically and mechanistically. And this love of mathematics and of mechanics sort of stick with Descartes throughout his entire life, even after he and Beeckman have a very nasty falling out where Descartes thinks Beeckman's taking too much credit for one of his mathematic discoveries, and Descartes writes this nasty public letter about how Beeckman's never done anything for him, and it's unpleasant. But Beeckman is actually a huge influence on Descartes, because unlike someone like Bacon, Descartes does keep in track of the scientific discoveries of his time, like William Harvey, the British scientist who's first figuring out the circulatory system. And Descartes continues this love of a mechanistic understanding of the world. This happens, therefore this happens. This force affects this. This force affects this. So, other influence on Descartes is the scholastic training he receives at La Flèche. So, La Flèche is founded by Henri IV as a Jesuit college. The Jesuits are sort of, if you don't know who they are, they're a little complicated, but they're essentially an academic branch of Catholicism, but they're very focused on conversion and going out in the world and founding schools. So because they're Jesuits and because they're Catholics, they follow Aquinas, they follow Aristotle, who at this point is a major, basically the scientist for Catholicism, and that's what they teach. So the science that Descartes learns, sort of as a teenager and into his early 20s, is all about causes and classification and this teleological focus of what's the end purpose of this, what's the end purpose of that. And Descartes mostly rejects it. You'll see some of it creep up in his writings, and it's actually not great when it does, because it's not great philosophy and it's not great science. So Descartes mostly rejects it. And just to remind you guys of what exactly I mean by this, I've brought back a quote from Aquinas' Quinque Viae, so the 5 ways to prove the existence of God, in which Aquinas is using his Aristotelian science. So it is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Now, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another, for nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality toward that towards which it is in motion, whereas a thing moves in as much as it is in act. So, yeah, so his explanation of motion is that things are in motion just because they want to be or they need to be with whatever they're moving towards. And like, for motion is nothing else than a reduction of something from potentiality to actuality, which like it's like almost science, but it's not quite, right? You sort of make sense. Oh, it's potential energy, but like, what does actuality mean? Like, but this is like, oh, it could have been moving, but now it is moving. So that which is actually hot, as fire, makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. So actually hot things are fire, and then everything else in the world, I guess, is potentially hot. And then fire makes things which can be hot, actually hot. So this is the stuff Descartes was learning, and this is the things he rejected when he focused on a mechanistic explanation of science. All right, cool. It is 9:58. Let's take a 5-minute break. So I will begin again at 10:03. Feel free to use the bathroom, grab a drink of water, grab a bite, take a 3-minute nap, but I will see you back here at 10:03. All right, and then we can talk about meditations on first philosophy. Okay. Is everyone prepared to begin again and learn a bit about meditations of first philosophy? Meditations on first philosophy. All right. The ayes have it. So let us begin again. So, Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes' sort of masterwork. It's first published in 1641 in Latin, so 9 years before Descartes' death, and then it's published in 1647 in French. There are 6 meditations in total. The first 2 meditations are very highly regarded, subsequent meditations less so. So my goal for this next hour is to get through the first 2 meditations, and then maybe we can talk about the other 4 if we have time. So it's been a standard intro text in philosophy since Descartes' time. If you take any Philosophy 101 class, you'll probably have to read an excerpt. Okay. So, it begins with a preface to the University of Paris professors, to the Sorbonne. Descartes is, you have to remember when he's writing this, he first of all wants the academic establishment to like him. Second of all, he doesn't want to get in trouble with the Catholic Church. So he has to say, why am I writing this? And so first he addresses himself to these professors. For although it is quite enough for us faithful ones to accept by means of faith that the human soul does not perish with the body and that God exists. So he says, even though it's enough for us who are believe in God to accept an existence of the soul and the existence of God, it certainly does not seem possible ever to persuade infidels of any religion. Indeed, may almost say of any moral virtue, unless to begin with we prove these two facts by means of the natural reason. So he's saying, I believe in the soul and I believe in God, and you believe in the soul and you believe in God. But if we're talking to infidels, if we're talking to non-Christians, we need to prove these things by logic, or else they're not going to believe it. So this is like important so we can make them believe in the existence of God and a soul. So this is why he's writing it. And he says, and in truth, I have noticed that you, along with all the theologians, did not only affirm that the existence of God may be proved by the natural reason, but also that it may be inferred from the Holy Scriptures. The knowledge about him is much clearer than that which we have of many created things. As a matter of fact, it's so easy to acquire that those who have it not are culpable in their ignorance. So, along with why he's doing it, he's saying, this actually fits in really well with what you guys already say, because you already say that, you can logically prove the existence of God. You already say you can logically get the existence of God from the Holy Scriptures, from the Bible. That it's easier to know about God than it is to know about a lot of things. And if you don't know about God, then you're culpable in your ignorance. Then it's your fault because you really should have tried harder. So again, he's fitting himself more with, he's making the professors like him. He's saying, well, I'm doing this because these are things you already believe and you're already doing, and I'm just helping you with what you already say. So when he's talking to these guys, he's trying not to be too radical about it. Then he talks to the reader, and he says, he gives you a brief outline of what the entire meditations is about. There's one part of his preface to the reader that I really love. He says, he starts off by saying, I know I've sort of mentioned this sort of stuff before, but you might be asking, why am I devoting a whole book to it now? And he responds to that question with saying, for these questions have always appeared to me to be of such importance that I judged it suitable to speak of them more than once. The road which I follow in the explanation of them is so little trodden, so far removed from the ordinary path, that I did not judge it to be expedient to set it forth at length in French and in a discourse which might be read by everyone, in case the feebler mind should believe that it was permitted to them to attempt to follow the same path. So he says, I'm writing a whole discourse about these questions because, first of all, they're so important that I need to speak about them more than once. Second of all, because not many other people have done this because it's so strange. This road is so little trodden, so many people have walked on this road, and it's so far removed from the ordinary path. It's so different from what most people are used to. That it's not a good idea to talk about it in French because then, feebler minds than stupider people would think, oh yeah, well, I can read this too. And he doesn't want people to read this. And the ironic thing is literally 6 years after he writes this in Latin, he publishes an edition in French. It's like, how do you like justify that? Like, you say, well, I'm never going to publish this in French. And then he does. So I think it's sort of funny. But that's the preface. There's not too much philosophy going on there. There's mostly just Descartes flattering his readers, and also trying to make sure he's not going to get in trouble with the Catholic Church. Okay, so let's start with the actual philosophy. So he begins with, "It is now some years since I detected how many were the false beliefs that I had from my earliest youth admitted as true. How doubtful was everything I had since constructed on this basis." So he's saying, it was a long time ago that I first thought about, man, a lot of the things I thought when I was younger that were true really aren't. They're false. And everything that I assume based on those truths are also false. That's a little problematic, right? He says, "And from that time I was convinced that I must once for all seriously undertake to rid myself of all the opinions which I had formerly accepted, commenced to build anew from the foundation, if I wanted to establish any firm and permanent structure in the sciences." So he says, it's been some years since I first detected, I first realized how many of the beliefs I thought were true are actually false, which means everything I've built up on those is false. And that realization has made me think, I just need to clear everything away. I need to know what I actually know and what I don't know, and so I can get a clear sense of what is true. If I really want to know what is true, I have to clear out everything that's not true in my mind. And for that end, it will not be requisite that I should examine each in particular, which would be an endless undertaking. For owing to the fact that the destruction of the foundation of necessity brings with it the downfall of the rest of the edifice, I shall only in the first place attack those principles upon which all my former opinions rested. And he says, okay, so in order to figure out what I know is true and what I know is false, it doesn't mean I actually need to think about literally everything that I know, because that's way too much. Really, all I need to do is figure out what is the most basic things. What is the foundation of what I know? If I can just take out the parts of the foundation that are false, you think of a house, you take out the rotten, support beams, then everything else that's false that's built on top of those will come crumbling away. I'll no longer think those things, and everything that'll be left are things that I know for sure. Makes sense, logical, as Descartes always is. So, what's the first thing that he's sort of destroying? Well, he says, all that up to the present time I have accepted as most true and certain, I have learned either from the senses or through the senses. But it is sometimes proved to me that these senses are deceptive, and it is wiser not to trust entirely to anything by which we have once been deceived. So, everything that he thinks is true are things he's heard, are things he's seen, are things he's smelled, right? So if right now you're hearing me speak and you're watching this PowerPoint presentation, these are all, anything I say that you accept as true are stuff you've gotten because you've seen it and you've heard it. But because sometimes these senses can be deceptive, you see something and you don't quite understand what you see, or you hear the wrong thing, you shouldn't trust it. You should never trust your senses ever again. This is, of course, why it's called radical skepticism. And here, I used it as a Jenga blocks as my little visual metaphor. So, say, take out this block here, and everything comes crumbling down. So if this was a false foundation, then everything up here would also be false. So if you take it away, boom, done. Okay. So let's elaborate a little more on this senses business. So at this moment, it does indeed seem to me that it is with eyes awake that I'm looking at this paper, that this head which I move is not asleep, That is deliberately and of set purpose that I extend my hand and perceive it. What happens in sleep does not appear so clear nor so distinct as does all this. But in thinking over this, I remind myself that on many occasions I have in sleep been deceived by similar illusions, and in dwelling carefully on this reflection, I see so manifestly that there are no certain indications by which we may clearly distinguish wakefulness from sleep that I am lost in astonishment. So, right now he's writing this book, okay? And it seems like he's awake. It doesn't feel like he's asleep. It feels like he's like choosing to write all this down. And he's like, yeah, it's like normally when I'm asleep, things aren't so clear, right? Then he says, but wait a sec. I know for a fact that sometimes I've been sleeping and I was so sure I was awake. And then I woke up and I was like, wow, I was sleeping this whole time. So there isn't really any way of telling sleepfulness from wakefulness. And so he also, before this, he considers the idea that he might be crazy, but he throws that out. I think at this point, sort of mental illness is just so foreign a concept that it's much easier for Descartes to say, maybe I'm sleeping than maybe I'm crazy. So, okay. So, what if he is asleep? What if, in fact, everything he's doing right now, he's just dreaming about? He's just dreaming that he's writing. He's dreaming that he's thinking. So then what can you say? Now let us assume that we are asleep and that all these particulars, e.g. that we open our eyes, shake our head, extend our hands, and so on, are but false delusions. And let us reflect that neither our hands nor our whole body are such as they appear to us to be. So we're actually sleeping, everything's fake, we can't assume anything is real, including what our hands look like. Nothing's real. At the same time, we must at least confess that the things which are represented us in sleep are like painted representations, which can only have been formed as the counterparts of something real and true. That in this way, those general things at least, eyes, a head, hands, and a whole body, are not imaginary things, things really existing. So he's saying, well, even if I am asleep, I have to admit that I never dream things which are totally made up. Like, at least they have some counterpart in the real world. Like, maybe I'm dreaming of a flying horse, but that's only because I've seen both birds and horses. So everything I dream is really existent. Nothing I dream can be totally made up. So, and for the same reason, although these general things, to wit, a body, eyes, a head, hands, and such like, may be imaginary, we are bound at the same time to confess that there are at least some other objects yet more simple and more universal, which are real and true. And of these, just in the same way as with certain real colors, all these images of things which dwell in our thoughts, whether true and real or false and fantastic, are formed. So he's saying, well, I mean, maybe I'm dreaming right now. Maybe I'm dreaming my hands. Maybe I'm dreaming my body. Maybe I'm dreaming my eyes. But, you know, that still means hands do exist. Heads do exist. And there should be things even more simple and universal than that, which have to be real. Like, you know, I drew here like a red triangle. Like, you can't make that up completely. Like, red triangles are this mental construct. And those have to exist in some sense, even if they just exist as mental constructs. They have to exist in some sense, right? And he says, that seems fair. That seems fair. That is possibly why our reasoning is not unjust when we conclude from this that physics, astronomy, medicine, and all other sciences, which have as their end the consideration of composite things, are very dubious and uncertain. But that arithmetic, geometry, and other sciences of that kind, which only treat of things that are very simple and very general, without taking great trouble to ascertain whether they are actually existent or not, contain some measure of certainty and an element of the indubitable. So he's saying, yeah, if I'm dreaming, then everything I think about physics is obviously going to be false because I can't rely on, um, my vision. And same thing with astronomy, and same thing with medicine. But when you think of stuff like arithmetic or geometry, if you think of the idea that a triangle has three sides, or that 1 plus 2 equals 3, like it seems like that has to be true, right? There has to be some element of the indubitable. You can't doubt that a triangle has three sides. Like maybe triangles don't actually exist, but as a mental construct, triangles have three sides, right? Well, maybe not. And besides, as I sometimes imagine that others deceive themselves in the things which they think they know best, how do I know that I am not deceived every time that I add 2 and 3, or count the sides of a square, or judge if things get simpler, if anything simpler can be imagined? So he's saying, well, I have known people who think they really know what they're talking about, and they are completely wrong. So how do I know that I'm not completely wrong when I try to add 2 and 3 to get 5? Or when I count the sides of a square and say there are 4 sides of a square? Like, maybe I'm wrong when I say that. Maybe that's just not true. And possibly God has not desired that I should be thus deceived, for he is said to be supremely good. If, however, it is contrary to his goodness to have made me such that I constantly deceive myself, it also appear to be contrary to his goodness to permit me to be sometimes deceived. Nevertheless, I cannot doubt that he does permit this. And this is a objection that I think would be more important to Aristotle than to a modern argument or modern reader. He says, well, you might say, well, you can't be wrong about the sides of a square because it wouldn't be, God wouldn't want you that way. Like, God can't just be constantly deceiving you. He says, well, I mean, by that logic, I think that, God should never be deceiving me. Never mind always, he shouldn't deceive me once. But I can't help but think there have been times when I've been very tired or distracted or something, and I've tried to add 2 and 3, and I got 6. I said 2 plus 3 equals 6. And I did that wrong once, and I didn't realize it at the time. So it does make me think that maybe I'm doing that all the time. Maybe I'm just constantly getting things wrong. Maybe God is fine with that. So what can you say about that? Well, you can say, that is why I consider that I shall not be acting amiss, if of taking of set purpose a contrary belief, I allow myself to be deceived, and for a certain time pretend that all these opinions are entirely false and imaginary, till at last, having thus balanced my former prejudices with my latter, so that they cannot divert my opinions more to one side than to the other, my judgment will no longer be dominated by bad usage or turned away from the right knowledge of the truth. So he's saying, well, considering that I can even be wrong about what 2 plus 3 equals, he's saying, let's say, I admit that's possible. So let's just say for now that everything I think is false. Everything I think is imaginary. So I'm doing this not because I actually think that, but because I know there are some things that I think are true that are actually false. So let's just think that everything's false, and then I'll find out what exactly is true. And yeah, that seems like a good idea to me. He's saying, I'm just doing this as a philosophic exercise, for I am assured that there can be neither peril nor error in this course, and I cannot at present yield too much distrust, so I'm not considering the question of action, but only of knowledge. It's not a bad idea to be doing this. Maybe it'd be a bad idea if, I had to run an errand or go to the market or something, then I can't assume that everything I know is false. But when I'm just trying to figure out what I actually know, sure, let's start with that, work to what I know is true, and then I'll be good. Okay. So he then makes an effort to get himself on the right back on the theological side of things, or on the in the theological right, not get the church too mad. He says, "I shall then suppose, not that God, who is supremely good and the fountain of truth, but some genius not less powerful than deceitful, has employed his whole energies in deceiving me. Shall consider that the heavens, the earth, colors, figures, sound, and all other external things are not but the illusions and dreams of which this genius has availed himself in order to lay traps for my credulity." So, he's saying, like, let me get myself on the right side of the Catholic Church. It's not that God who is deceiving me, but some evil genius, some demon, who's both powerful and deceitful. And everything I see, he makes fake. Everything I think, he makes fake. I think I try to come up with 2 plus 3, and he just sort of reaches in and he changes my thoughts. So I write down the wrong answer. I write 2 plus 3 equals 6, and I don't even realize I did it. That's because of this evil demon. So credulity here, by the way, means how much you believe something. So incredulous, they don't believe you. Credulous, they do believe you. Okay. So insensibly of my own accord, I fall back into my former opinions, and I dread awakening from the slumber, lest the laborious wakefulness which would follow the tranquility of this repose should have to be spent not in daylight, but in the excessive darkness of the difficulties which have just been discussed. So he seems to get pretty worked up about this. He's like, now I almost feel like I want to go back to sleep. Like I really regret this thought process of which I've realized that everything I know may be fake, because it's like waking up in darkness. Like you wake up and you're like, oh man, I don't know anything. I want to go back to when I thought I knew things. So yeah. Okay, that's meditation 1. We leave Descartes at the end of meditation 1, realizing that he can't say he knows anything and that he has to doubt everything, and it's a terrible place for him to be. Okay, before we go on to meditation 2, Nitingdalama. I think this is probably terrible intonation. Do you understand? Good? Any questions? All right. Great. The evil genius is just a demon or the devil. It doesn't matter. It's a thought experiment. If God is too good to deceive us, then our perception is believable. Maybe we can judge what we see or touch right or wrong directly. Although there are evils deceiving us, why do we need to doubt it? So remember, Descartes, first of all, he's not sure that God is too good to deceive us. He's not positive, because he says, certainly I'm wrong sometimes. So why can't I just say that God's wrong all the time? And second, he says, even if this isn't true completely, maybe I have gone too far in thinking that everything I know is false. But at the same time, I'm trying to discover what I know is true. So a good step to figure out what exactly I know is true is to start off by declaring everything I know false. It's sort of like if you need to clean your room, you're like, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take literally everything out of every drawer, right? I'm going to take every shirt out, every all my pants out, all of my toys, everything, and you're not going to throw all of it out, but it's a good step. So now you place them one by one back in what you want, and everything else you throw out. Does that make sense? Yeah. That was a good question. Thank you for asking. Any other questions before we go on to Meditations 2? No? All right. Let's go on to Meditations 2 then. By the way, one thing I do love about old time books, and Descartes no exception, is how terrible their chapter titles are. So his chapter title here is "Of the Nature of the Human Mind," and that it is more easily known than the body. You have to think like maybe it was just a different tradition, but it's so hard to say, and you can't think of that as like really, something that would sell particularly well, having that long and complicated title. But I guess it worked for him because this did actually sell quite well. It was a very popular book even as soon as it was published. Okay, so Meditations 2. Descartes is doubting everything and he's feeling pretty bad about it. So what does he do now? Well, he says, I shall proceed by setting aside all that in which the least doubt could be supposed to exist, just as if I had discovered that it was absolutely false. And I shall ever follow in this road until I have met with something which is certain, or at least, if I can do nothing else, till I learn for certain that there is nothing in the world that is certain. Archimedes, in order that he might draw the terrestrial globe out of his place and transport it elsewhere, demanded that only one point should be fixed and immovable. In the same way, I have the right to conceive high hopes if I am happy enough to discover one thing only which is certain and indubitable. So, as he says, I'm gonna keep just going through everything in the world until I either find the one thing which is true and can't be doubted, or on the other hand, maybe I'll find that nothing in the world is true. Sort of like a Socratic answer, right? Maybe I'll find that I'm the smartest guy in the world because I'm the only one who realizes that I know nothing. And then Descartes compares himself to Archimedes, who discovers the lever and, said, I don't know if he actually said this, but the story goes that he said, give me a lever long enough and a place to stand and I'll move the world. And he's saying, same thing here. Just give me one thing I know for sure. One thing I can't doubt, and that'll be enough to move the world. All right. So he's thinking, well, I've said there's this evil demon who's told me that there's, nothing at all in the world, that I don't know anything. Um, well, can I say that there is no heaven, no earth, no minds, no body? Sure. Was I not then likewise persuaded that I did not exist? Not at all. Of a surety, I myself did exist, since I persuaded myself something, or merely because I thought of something. There is some deceiver or other, very powerful and very cunning, who ever employs his ingenuity in deceiving me. Then without doubt, I exist also if he deceives me. Let him deceive me as much as he will, can never cause me to be nothing so long as I think I am something. So that after having reflected well and carefully examined all things, I must come to the definite conclusion that this proposition, I exist, is necessarily true each time that I pronounce it or that I mentally conceive it. So, he says, well, I can say that nothing in this world I know for sure, but I have to exist. Because whether I'm persuaded that everything I know is true or everything I know is false, I am still persuaded of something. I am still thinking something. Even if there's some demon who's constantly tricking me, he has to be tricking someone. I have to exist if he's tricking me. And he can trick me of everything that he wants, but he can't make me not be something because he has to be tricking someone. So that means that every time we say or we think, I exist, that means that's true. That's the one thing you can say which is always true. You can say, I exist, and it's true. It doesn't mean that you only exist when you're thinking that you exist, but it does mean that every time you say that or every time you think that it's true. Okay, so Descartes pretty quickly comes to his immovable point. That wasn't too hard. So what else can you say about thinking? Well, we can say we exist. What else? What is thinking? I find here that thought is an attribute that belongs to me. It alone cannot be separated from me. I exist, that is certain. But how often? Just when I think. For might possibly be the case if I ceased entirely to think, that I should likewise cease altogether to exist. I do not now admit anything which is not necessarily true. To speak accurately, I am not more than a thing which thinks, that is to say, a mind or a soul, or an understanding, or a reason, which are terms whose significance was formerly unknown to me. I am, however, a real thing, and really exist. But what thing? I have answered, a thing which thinks. So, you can't, he's saying, what can we say about thought? Well, thought belongs to you. It can't be separated from you. And he's saying, well, it's possible that I would no longer exist if I stopped thinking. Every time I think I know I exist, but maybe one day I won't think that and I will no longer exist. And he's saying, I'm being very, very careful here. When I say I need to be very careful about who I is. I'm a thing which thinks. I'm a mind, I'm a soul, I'm an understanding, I'm a reason. That's all I can say. I'm just something which is thinking, I am. That's it. Can't say anymore. And remember, Russell says Descartes is even going too far with this. Russell thinks Descartes should have just said, there are thoughts. He doesn't think that Descartes should even say, I am something. He says, all Descartes should really be saying is, thoughts exist. But Descartes apparently doesn't buy that. He says, I'm definitely a mind. That's for sure. And here we have Rodin's famous The Thinker. All right. So what else can we say? What else can we say now that we know I think, therefore I am? Finally, I am the same who feels, that is to say, who perceives certain things. As by the organs of sense, so in truth I see light, I hear noise, I feel heat. But it will be said that these phenomena are false and that I am dreaming. Let it be so. Still, it is at least quite certain that it seems to me that I see light, that I hear noise, and that I feel heat. So we can say, not only do we think, but also that we feel. Given that we are a thing which thinks,
Um, that means we are hungry, we are hot, we are hearing things. And it doesn't mean that these things actually exist. It doesn't mean we actually need food or are lacking food. It doesn't mean that we're actually thirsty or need drinks. It doesn't mean that there's actually light out there, but it does mean that that's what we're feeling. That can't be denied. We are feeling these things. From this time, I begin to know what I am with a little more clearness and distinction than before. But nevertheless, it still seems to me I cannot prevent myself from thinking that corporeal things, whose images are framed by thought, which are tested by the senses, are much more distinctly known than that obscure part of me which does not come under the imagination. So he's beginning to know what he is with a little more clearness, a little more distinction. I get a sense of who I am, and I know I think things, and I know I feel things. But there's something strange here, because he's like, yeah, I've proved all this logically, but still I can't help but think that things which exist have a body, and I can feel, and I can see, and I can touch. They do seem very real, and they seem much more real than this abstract thought. Like, you know, when you're hungry, food is much more real than reason. Seems a little weird considering we can prove reason, but we can't prove that food exists. What is there to say about that? Let us take, for example, this piece of wax. It has been taken quite freshly from the hive. It has not yet lost the sweetness of the honey which it contains. Still retains somewhat of the odor of flowers from which it has been culled. Its flower, its color, its figure, its size are apparent. It is hard, cold, easily handled. If you strike it with the finger, it will emit a sound. Finally, all of the things which are requisite to cause us distinctly to recognize the body are met with in it. But notice that while I speak and approach the fire, what remained of the taste is exhaled, the smell evaporates, the color alters, the figure is destroyed, the size increases, becomes liquid, it heats, scarcely one can handle it. When one strikes it, no sound is emitted. Does the same wax remain after this change? We must confess that it remains. None would judge otherwise. What then did I know so distinctly in this piece of wax? So he takes a piece of wax, which remember is like what honey, and there's also candle wax, which is what I have here, picture here. So you can say, yeah, like this wax, it starts off and it's a little sweet and it smells a bit of flowers. It's like orange and it's hard and it's cold. And then you take it to the fire. It doesn't taste like anything. It doesn't smell like anything. It turns white. It's no longer in a honeycomb shape. It melts. So why do we still think it's the same piece of wax? You know, you look at this candle from here to here, obviously the same candle. If I, for instance, if you were in a room and you saw this candle and there was a flame at the top, and then you left the room for a couple hours and you came back and the candle looked like this, you'd say, well, the candle must have melted. Why do you think that? This looks totally different from this. Why do you think that they're the same candle? Well, let's think about it. Let us attentively consider this, and abstracting from all that does not belong to the wax, let us see what remains. Certainly nothing remains excepting a certain extended thing which is flexible and movable. But what is the meaning of flexible and movable? Is it not that I imagine that this piece of wax being round is capable of becoming square, passing from a square to a triangular figure? No, certainly it is not that, as I imagine it admits of an infinitude of similar changes. Nevertheless, I do not know how to compass the infinitude by my imagination. Consequently, this conception which I have of the wax is not brought about by the faculty of imagination. So he's thinking, well, I don't know it by smell or taste or whatever. All I can say is the wax, it's an extended thing, which is this scholastic term just meaning it exists, and you can change it. And he's saying, well, I mean, does that mean I can think of changing it into anything? Well, no. I mean, if this candle, had suddenly become, say, in the shape of, I don't know, the Taj Mahal or Beijing Opera House, you light it on fire, you come back a couple hours later, and all of a sudden it looks like the Beijing Opera House, you'd assume it was a different candle. You wouldn't assume it was the same one. So there must be some other thought process going on than just this idea of, oh yeah, candles change shape, wax change shape, that's fine. What is this other thought process that we're doing? Well, but what must particularly be observed is that its perception is neither an act of vision, nor of touch, nor of imagination, and has never been such, although it may have appeared formerly to be so, but only an intuition of the mind, which may be imperfect and confused as it was formerly, clear and distinct as it is at present, according to my attention, as my attention is more or less directed to the elements which are found in it, and of which it is composed. So, what makes you think of, um, you know, that it's the same candle after it's melted? Well, you've probably always thought, oh yeah, because I can see it, or I can feel it, or whatever. Or even I can imagine it. Like in my imagination, I've seen candles and I've seen melted candles, and I'm fine with that. And Descartes says, no, 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 no. You think that, but that's incorrect. Really, you've only been understanding things through an intuition of your mind. And like, yeah, your mind might be focused or it might be indistinct. But that's really the only way you're understanding this candle, is some intuition, some innate thought process. So, for we see that the same wax, if it is present, and not that we simply judge that it is same from its having the same color and figure. From this I should conclude that I knew the wax by means of vision and not simply by the intuition of the mind. Unless by chance I remember that, looking from a window and saying I see men who pass in the street, I really do not see them, but infer that what I see is men, just as I say that I see wax. Yet what do I see from the window but hats and coats which may cover automatic machines? Yet I judge these to be men. So we're saying we see the same wax before it melts, after it melts. And we're not just saying we see it because it has the same color and the same figure. And it's sort of like if you're looking out onto the street, and I've got a picture here, you think this is a person, right? You think this is a picture of a person in New York. But how do you know it's not just some sort of machine or some sort of sculpture? Could be. You could easily imagine making a sculpture that looks like this, or making a robot that looks like this, especially if you put all these clothes there. Sort of hard to tell. They're all covered up. They've got the umbrella. Why can't you say that's just a machine, just a sculpture, just a robot? But you never think that. You always think, oh yeah, that's a person. In this case, probably a woman, because they're carrying a purse. So why do you think that? Because you've seen these people with your mind. So, finally, here I am, having insensibly reverted to the point I desired. For since it is now manifest to me that even bodies are not properly speaking known by the senses or by the faculty of imagination, by the understanding only, and since they are not known from the fact that they are seen or touched, but only because they are understood, I see clearly that there is nothing which is easier for me to know than my mind. So he's saying after he's thought all this stuff about wax, he's gotten back to where he started from. He doesn't really, he's saying everything that he sees, he thought originally things which I see are real to me, or things which I imagine are real to me. But it's not true. Everything is by the understanding. All of the wax that you thought you were understanding by seeing, you're really understanding in your mind. And so then we have a sense of this is why they feel so real, because they are in our mind. And when you're hungry and you want food, the reason why food is so real is not because you smell it or because you see it, but because you interpret something as food, and you interpret it in your mind. So Descartes brings this all back to the mind again. Everything is perception through the mind. You think, you feel, you know things through your mind. So that's the end of second meditation on philosophy. There are 4 more of these, but we really don't have enough time to cover them. I would advise you cover, if you want to read something yourself, I have excerpts from Meditation 6 and the Word document, which I think is the only other meditation which is really worth reading, especially as Descartes brings in mathematics and science, which is pretty interesting. And then, yeah, skip 3, 4, 5. Especially skip his proofs of God, which are not very good. But yeah, check out, if you want to read on your own, read the excerpts of 6 in the Word document. But before that, on to our conclusion. So, it's easy to see why Russell calls Descartes the first modern philosopher. What Descartes does is particularly impressive. He says, let's assume everything's false, and he uses skepticism to scrape away everything that might not be true, and then he builds up from first principles. I mean, that's a big philosophic accomplishment. His construction really isn't great, which you'll learn for yourself, or you can just take my word for it, when he starts saying, and the way we know things in the world are real is because God is good. Not so great, but the attempt and the destruction before, fantastic. But what Descartes didn't realize, that's what unbeknownst means, what Descartes doesn't realize is, as he's becoming the first modern philosopher, he's actually also starting a division between philosophy and science. Because philosophy turns into philosophy of the mind. We know things mentally, and meanwhile science is of course all worried about what we know physically. And that's going to be a big division, and a division which had already started and which Descartes was trying to repair is mathematics and philosophy. There will be, after Descartes, more mathematician philosophers, but they become less and less frequent, even though both deal with logic, until you get to the present day, when there are really very few philosophers who even know much of mathematics, and vice versa. Russell actually is an interesting counterpoint, because Bertrand Russell was pretty great mathematician. So then how do we describe Descartes' legacy? Well, he raises deep and difficult questions, which plague philosophy to this day, and then he doesn't do a great job at answering them. So it's a complex legacy. But what we can say for sure, the one thing we know is true, is that philosophy turns from Descartes into, you privilege mind, you privilege thought processes. and you privilege that over everything else. You don't pay so much attention to imagination or to what you see. It's all having to do with what you think and what you reason. Which means that philosophy after Descartes turns inward and abstract, which is in a lot of ways where we still are today. One interesting sort of thing is that science, on the other hand, after a very long time, also turns inward with neuroscience and neurology and psychiatry. And so you get also philosophy's turf is encroached upon, and that's still a problem today. And actually, in the Reddit discussion questions, which again, please answer, I'll mention a neurologist who provides a scientific thing that I think would be interesting to think about. Okay. So, yeah, I hope you enjoyed today's lesson on Descartes. Thank you as always for the roses. They're much appreciated. And yeah, so I'll see you guys again next week. Also, I don't know if you know this, but Gushu has, and I have a Shimalaya account. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And I release like weekly episodes where I talk about logical puzzles and paradoxes, and also excerpts from famous philosophical works. There's no visual component, but there's an audio component. So if you want to listen to it on your way to work or on your way to school, yeah, very brainwashing in a good way. Okay, yeah, so if you want to listen to my dulcet tones on the way to work or on the way to school and learn a bit more philosophy and have fun with it, yeah, feel free to listen to our episodes on Shimalaya. And yeah, are there any questions about Descartes that I should answer in these last 2 minutes? Does anyone want to, how to define a mind? Not an object like a thinking machine. Interesting question. I would say for Descartes, a mind is something which reasons, logic, deduction, whatever. And remember, he thinks of it as immaterial. It doesn't really exist. It's not like solid, like a hand. Other philosophers after Descartes will say the mind is just sort of arising from the brain. So it's hard to say. Descartes would just say that a mind, yeah, Descartes would say that a mind is identical to a soul. Not everyone believes him, and there's a lot of debate, but Descartes would certainly say that a mind is a soul. Good question. How can Descartes equal I to thing? Because he said a thing I thinks. Well, I wouldn't agree that I belongs to matter. I would say I is certainly a matter of, sorry, I is certainly like the soul, the mind. I don't think Descartes would agree that I is like your body. I think he says I is the mind. Okay, and when he says a thing, he doesn't mean like a physical thing. He's just saying something. He needs a word. Yiga dongxi. Actually, I don't know if dongxi necessarily means a physical thing. I need better Chinese. Okay. What's the main difference with bacon? Well, you'll have to see the bacon lesson again. But as you'll find, Bacon is very concerned about knowledge about the outside world and how do we discover knowledge about the outside world. So even though they did know about each other, Descartes certainly knew about Bacon anyways, they take very different approaches, and what they consider important are very different. And it's hard to imagine that Bacon would even care that much about Descartes' meditations. Yeah, and induction versus deduction is also a big difference. Bacon is very big on induction, and Descartes has no truck with it. He is not a fan of induction whatsoever. Descartes is all deduction. All right, good question. Any other ones? Or shall we sign off? All right, let's sign off. Thank you all very much. I'll see you next week and on Reddit. All right, bye-bye.